Grief does not always come as a storm. Sometimes it comes as a habit. A quiet ache you learn to carry from one gray morning to the next, until the day something refuses to let you carry it in peace. For 2 years, Corin Fell, the Duke of Valemore, had told himself the war had already taken everything worth loving. His brother was dead. The great house stood silent. And the one living thing that still belonged to that brother, an old gray war stallion with a scarred flank, had begun to do something no man on the estate could explain. Again and again it broke free of its paddock and vanished across the moor. Always to the same place, one forgotten cottage at the far edge of his land. The Duke expected to find a broken fence, and nothing more. Instead, the door opened, and a small boy looked up at him with his dead brother's eyes. The moor did not forgive carelessness, and neither did Corin Fell. He rode its boundaries himself now, as he did most mornings, because the exercise was the only thing that quieted the ache in his chest, and because he no longer trusted the quiet of the house. Valemore Hall rose behind him out of the mist, a long spine of dark northern stone, older than the title itself, ringed by wind-bent rowans and the low clouds that hung over Northumberland from October clear through to spring. It was not a warm place. It had not been warm since the letter came. Corin remembered the letter the way other men remembered a wound. A single sheet, official and bloodless, informing His Grace that Major Gideon Fell had fallen with distinction in the closing hours of Waterloo. Distinction, as though the word were meant to be a comfort, as though it could fill the chair across the breakfast table, or answer the 100 small jokes that no longer had anywhere to land. Gideon had been the bright one, the easy one. Where Corin was all silence and duty, and the heavy business of a dukedom, Gideon had laughed his way through the world and been forgiven everything for it. He had bought a commission against Corin's wishes, ridden south, and never come home. What had come home instead, months later, thin and lame, and half wild with grief of its own, was his horse. The gray was old now, and stiff in the cold, and useless for anything a working estate required. Any sensible man would have put him out to a soft pasture and forgotten him. Corin had tried. He had told himself a dozen times that keeping the animal was sentiment, and that sentiment was a luxury he could not afford, not with the accounts in the state they were in. And every time he had walked down to the paddock, looked into that scarred gray face, and been unable to give the order. The horse was the last warm thing his brother's hands had touched. That was the whole of it. That was the trap Corin could not reason his way out of, which was why the escapes unsettled him so. They had begun in the late summer. Tam, the youngest of the grooms, had come running up to the house one morning, white as a sheet, certain the old gray had been stolen, or worse. They found him by noon, 3 miles off, standing patient as a churchyard stone outside a low stone cottage on the western edge of the estate, a place Corin had half forgotten existed. They led him home. 2 days later he was gone again. The same cottage, the same patient, waiting at the same gate. Corin had the paddock fence raised. Bracken cleared it. He had the gate chained. The horse waited by the wall until someone left it open, and then he was gone. Unhurried, deliberate, as though he had somewhere he was expected to be. It was not the aimless wandering of a confused old animal. There was a purpose in it that made the hair rise on the back of Corin's neck, because a purpose meant a reason, and Corin could not imagine what reason a horse could have for choosing that one cold cottage out of the whole wide emptiness of the moor. He might have let it lie. He was a busy man and a tired one, and the estate gave him trouble enough without chasing a runaway horse across the heather. But the cottage sat on Valemore land, and lately Corin had reason to be careful about every acre of it. His cousin had seen to that. Crispin Fell was the sort of relation every great family kept, and no great family wanted. A smiling, soft-handed man who dressed a decade too young and spoke of his devotion to the family name at precisely the volume required for others to hear it. As matters stood, with Gideon dead and Corinne unmarried, Crispin was heir presumptive to Valemar. He had taken to reminding Corinne of this with a tenderness that set the Duke's teeth on edge. He had taken, too, to arriving unannounced, to asking clever questions about the rents and the timber and the northern farms, and to leaving behind him a faint, persistent smell of debt, as though he trailed his creditors through the halls like mud. Karin was not a suspicious man by nature, but he had learned in 2 hard years that the world rarely troubled to be gentle, and that a man who asked so many questions about an inheritance was usually planning to collect on it. So when Tam came up to the stable yard that gray morning, cap in his hands, and said the words Corin had come to dread, the Duke did not sigh, and send a boy to fetch the horse. "He's gone again, your grace." "Same as always." The old gray's at the cottage on the west edge. Corin looked out past the rowans to where the moor rolled off into the mist and hid its secrets. "Saddle my horse," he said. "This time I will go and see for myself." The cottage was smaller than Corin remembered, and far more alive. He had expected a ruin. What he found, as he came down the last slope with the wind at his back, was a low, sturdy house, with smoke rising honest and straight from its chimney, a mended roof, a kitchen garden clawed out of the hard ground and defended against the moor with a wall of loose gray stone. Someone lived here, someone worked, and worked hard, to make so bleak a corner of the world hold together. And there, in the small paddock beside the house, stood Bracken. Not fretting, not pacing the gate, as he did at Valemore. The old gray stood with his head low and his eyes half closed, entirely at ease, as though he had at last set down a weight he had carried a very long way. Corin had not seen the horse look like that in 2 years. It stopped him cold in the saddle. He dismounted at the gate and had taken no more than 3 steps toward the door when it opened, and his way was barred. The woman who came out was old, small, and about as welcoming as the stone wall. She planted herself square in the path, with a set to her jaw that would not have shamed a sergeant, a heavy iron poker held down at her side, in a grip that made plain she knew how to use it. Her eyes went from Corin's fine coat to his fine boots, to his face, and narrowed. "That's far enough," she said. "We've no charity to spare for gentlemen who lose their horses." "The horse is mine," Corin said evenly. "Or, rather, it was my brother's. I've come only to understand why he keeps finding his way to your gate." "Have you?" It was not a question. "And what's your name, then?" "That comes riding up so grand Fell," he said. "Corin Fell." He watched the name land on her. It was subtle, no more than a flicker, a tightening at the corner of her mouth, a quick, sharp breath she tried to hide. But he had spent 2 years reading the faces of men who wanted something from him, and he knew fear when he saw it move behind an old woman's eyes. She was not afraid of him. She was afraid of what his name meant. And that, more than the horse, more than the mended roof, was what fixed Corin's boots to the ground. "There's no one here for you," she said, and her voice had changed, lower now, almost pleading beneath the iron. "Take your horse and go home, your grace, please. There's naught here but an old woman, and a good deal of nothing." But she had said your grace. He had told her only his name. "You know who I am," Corin said quietly. Behind her, in the dim gap of the doorway, something moved, a small, pale shape, low to the ground. A child's face, there and then gone, drawn back into the shadow by a hand Corin could not see. Just long enough for him to catch the shine of two wide, watching eyes. He knew those eyes. He had grown up across a nursery from those eyes. He had watched them close. For the last time in a coffin 2 years ago, or believed he had. The old woman stepped sideways, quick for her age, and put herself between the Duke and the door. "Go home," she said, "for the boy's sake, if not your own." Corin did not go home. He stood at the threshold of a stranger's cottage, with the wind pulling at his coat and his brother's horse dozing behind him, and understood, with the slow, cold certainty of a man watching the ground open, that the war had not, after all, taken everything. It had left something out here on the moor, and someone had gone to a great deal of trouble to keep him from finding it. He did not sleep. Corin sat up the whole night in the cold study at Vailmore, with a single candle and his brother's miniature in his hand, turning the small painted face to the light, and back again, until the wax guttered down to nothing. He knew those eyes. He had spent his whole boyhood beside those eyes, ruled by their mischief and forgiving their every fault, and 2 years ago he had watched a sealed coffin lowered into the family vault, believing them lost to him forever. Yet he had seen them again that very afternoon, alive and frightened, in the doorway of a stranger's cottage on the far edge of his own land. By the time the gray dawn came up over the moor, he had decided, whatever the truth of that cottage was, he would not learn it second-hand, and above all, he would not let Crispin learn it first. He rode out before the house had stirred, before even the grooms were up, with the miniature buttoned inside his coat against his heart. This time the old woman did not bar the path with her poker, though she stood ready in the doorway as if she might. She looked at him a long, measuring moment, and something in his face must have told her that the time for turning him away was past, because she gave a short, grim nod, as one accepts weather that cannot be helped, and stepped back. "You had best come in, then," she said, "since you'll not have the sense to leave, but mind your voice. The child frightens easy, and God knows he's had cause." The cottage was 1 room and a loft, scrubbed and mended, and poor, and it stopped Corin's breath, because his brother was everywhere in it. A cavalry saber hung on 2 pegs above the hearth, cleaned and oiled by hands that loved it. A shelf of Gideon's boyhood books stood against the far wall, carried here, one at a time, Corin did not doubt, in a saddlebag across the moor. There was 1 good chair by the fire, a heavy old wing-backed thing that had no business in a laborer's cottage, and Corin knew it at once for the reading chair that had stood in Gideon's rooms at Vailmore and vanished the year before the war. His brother had carried his whole hidden happiness out here piece by piece and told no one, not even him. A figure rose from beside that chair as he entered. The woman who stepped into the light was perhaps 30, though hardship had drawn its lines about her eyes and threaded a little early gray into her dark hair. She was tall and plainly dressed, her hands red and roughened by work no lady of Corin's acquaintance had ever done in her life. But she held herself like someone who had decided long ago that she would not be made small by any man, and when she looked at Corin, it was directly, without a curtsy, without a trace of deference. With the flat, steady courage of a person who has already lost the thing she was most afraid to lose, and therefore has nothing left with which she can be threatened. "You are the Duke," she said. It was not a greeting, it was a reckoning. "I am, and you know my brother's face when you see it. Madam, your son wears it like a coat." For a long moment she said nothing. The fire snapped. Somewhere behind her, a small foot scuffed the boards of the loft, and a gentle hand drew it back. "His name is Tobin," she said at last, very quietly, and though her voice was steady, he could hear what it cost her to keep it so. "He is 2 years old, and, yes, your grace, since you have come all this way to hear it said aloud, he is Gideon's son. He is also mine, and I will lie down and die on this doorstep before I let you or any man of your house take him from me." The words came out fierce as a struck flint, but Corin heard the terror running beneath them like a cold current, and understanding arrived in him all at once, whole and shaming. She was not hiding from the world, she was hiding from him. From his name, his rank, the long cold reach of his power. She believed the Duke of Valemore had ridden out at last to strip a widow of her child and cast her onto the moor with nothing, and she had spent a sleepless night of her own bracing to fight a battle she knew she could not win. He thought of every cruel and lawful thing a man in his position might do to a woman with no name and no protector, and he was ashamed to his bones that she had reason to expect it of him. "May I come further in?" he said, out of the cold. She had braced for a great many things. She had not braced for that. He watched the simple courtesy disarm her more thoroughly than any threat could have done, watched suspicion war with a wild, reluctant hope across her tired face. Slowly, warily, as one steps aside for something that might yet prove dangerous, she moved from the hearth and let him pass, and there, half hidden behind the old woman's skirts, stood the boy. He was small and dark, and grave beyond his years, and he was watching the tall stranger with enormous solemn eyes, and he was trembling, not with cold. The child had one defiant little fist knotted in the frame of the hearth, his whole body wound tight to bolt, and he was not staring at Corinne at all. He was staring past him, through the open door, out to the paddock where the old gray stallion stood patient in the thin morning light. "He thinks," said Marin, and her voice cracked clean across at last, "that you have come to take away the horse." Corin looked at the boy. He looked at the raw terror in that small, brave face, the terror of a child who owns nothing in the wide world but one old animal and cannot bear to lose that too, on top of everything already taken from him before he was old enough to remember it. And whatever the great house, and the heavy title, and 2 grinding years of grief had frozen solid in Corin Fell, cracked quietly and completely, right there on the swept dirt floor of his brother's secret home. He did not draw himself up to his height. He did not command. He crossed the little room and lowered himself down, slowly and deliberately, heedless of his fine coat trailing in the cold ashes, until he was kneeling on the floor with his eyes level with his brother's son. "Tobin," he said, "that is a very great deal of horse for so small a fellow to command. Do you look after him yourself?" The boy's chin wobbled. He managed one tiny, fierce nod. "He runs away," Tobin whispered, the words tumbling out despite his fear. "He runs all the way here across the moor. Hesper says he oughtn't, and Mama says he'll be caught, but he does it anyway. He comes to see me. He likes me best." "He does," Corin agreed, and his own voice was no longer entirely steady. "He has been running away for months, Tobin, and no wall in all of Northumberland could hold him, and not one grown man on my whole estate could understand the reason. But I understand it, now that I have met you. He was your father's horse. His name is Bracken, and your father loved him better than any creature living. And on the little scraps of leave the war ever gave him, your father would ride this old horse, across the whole width of the moor, to this very door, to you and your mother, so that of all the places in the world, this cottage is the one your father chose for his happiness, and the one place besides your father's own side that Bracken ever knew as home. That is why he runs. He has been trying, all this time with his old failing strength, to come home to the last part of your father, left anywhere in the world. He has been trying to come home to you." The child stared up at him, scarcely breathing. "So he is yours," Corin said. "He was always coming home to you. No one will ever take him from you again. Not while I draw breath. You have my word on it, and a fell keeps his word, always. Your father taught me that long before you were born." For a moment, nothing moved in the little room but the firelight on the saber above the hearth. Then the boy let go of the hearth frame, took 2 small, uncertain steps across the floor, and pressed his face hard against the shoulder of the uncle he had never met, and wept the way only a very young child can weep, with his whole body at once, for a father he could not remember and had somehow never stopped grieving. Corin gathered him up and held him. Over the dark little head he looked up and found the boy's mother standing rigid by the fire, with both worn hands pressed to her mouth, and tears standing bright in her eyes. And he understood that in the space of a single moment, without meaning to, and without any effort at all, he had undone 2 entire years of the cruel stories she had been forced to tell herself about the sort of man he was. "Sit down, madam," he said very gently, over the child's dark hair. "Please, you have carried this alone long enough. Sit down in your own home, by your own fire, and let me carry some small part of it now." Port. And Marin fell, who had held her ground against cold, against hunger, against fear, against the whole vast unfeeling weight of the house of Valemore, sat down at last in her dead husband's chair, and for the first time since a folded letter out of Belgium had ended the world she knew, she allowed herself, in front of another living soul, to be something other than strong. Hesper, by the door, turned her face to the wall and pretended with great dignity to be seeing to the fire. It was a long while before any of them was ready to speak of what must come next. But even as the boy's frantic breathing slowed and steadied against his shoulder, one hard, cold thought was already taking shape in the back of Corin's mind, sharp and unwelcome as a drawn blade. If this child was truly Gideon's son, born in wedlock, then he, and not Crispin, stood heir to everything the Fells possessed. And Crispin was a desperate, smiling, ruined man who had lately been asking a great many questions about the western edge of the moor. They let the boy sleep. When Tobin had at last cried himself into exhaustion, Hesper carried him up to the loft, and for the first time Corin and Marin were left to speak plainly, 2 grown people on either side of a small fire, taking the measure of one another. "Tell me all of it," Corin said. "From the beginning, I need the truth, madam, every part of it, if I am to protect you." So she told him how Gideon had been quartered at her father's town while he recovered from a wound taken in Spain, and her father, a garrison surgeon with more learning than money. How Gideon, who charmed the whole world without trying, had, for once in his life, been in earnest. How they had married quietly in a country church with 2 witnesses and a true entry in a true register, because they both knew what the family would say of a duke's brother wedding a surgeon's daughter, and Gideon had sworn he would bring it into the open himself in his own way when the war was done. How he had brought her to the empty cottage on the edge of his brother's land, the one corner of Valemore where no one ever came, and made it briefly, secretly, a home. How he had gone back to his regiment with a laugh and a promise, and how the promise had died with him in the mud at Waterloo before their son was 3 months old. "I was alone," Marin said, "with an infant, and no name I dared to use, and a great family who had never heard of me. I had heard all the stories of the cold Duke of Valemore. Forgive me. I believed that if I came to your door you would take Gideon's son to raise as your heir, and put me out, because that is what such families do, and I would never see my child again. So I stayed where he had hidden me, and I kept us alive. You did more than that, Corin said. You kept the proof. She looked at him a long moment. Then she rose, went to a loose stone beside the hearth, and drew out an oilcloth bundle she had plainly guarded with her life. Inside was a marriage line, properly signed and witnessed, a ring, a packet of letters in a hand Corin would have known anywhere, and one letter sealed that had never been opened, addressed on the outside in Gideon's careless scrawl to my brother Corin, to be given only if I do not come home. Corin's hands were not steady as he broke the seal. His brother's voice rose up off the page as though he stood in the room. Gideon apologized for nothing, as he never had in life. He wrote that he had married the best woman in England, and made a son he was prouder of than any battle honor. He wrote that he knew Corin would do the decent thing, because Corin had always done the decent thing, even when it cost him, even when Gideon had not. Look after them, Corin. Not out of duty. You have enough of that to bury a man. Look after them because he is mine, and because you are the only one I would trust with what is mine. And be happy, brother. For God's sake, you have spent your whole life being responsible. Let this be the thing that finally makes you glad. Corin read it twice. Then he folded it with great care and sat a long while looking into the fire, and Marin had the grace to let him. He asked me to be glad, Corin said at last roughly. I had forgotten how. He was good at it, Marin said. It was the only thing he was ever any good at. And to his surprise, Corin laughed, a short, rusty sound, and something old and locked in his chest eased by a fraction. Then he set the letter down and became once more a man with a great and dangerous problem to solve. Listen to me carefully, he said. What you have kept in that oilcloth is not merely precious to me. It is the most valuable and the most dangerous thing in this county. That marriage line makes Tobin legitimate. Legitimate, he is my brother's son and my nearest heir, and he stands between my cousin Crispin and everything Crispin has spent 2 years believing would fall to him. Crispin is bankrupt, madam. I have suspected it for months. A man that desperate, who learns there is a small boy on the moor, standing between him and a dukedom, is capable of a very great deal. The color left Marin's face. Then we must never let him learn of it. No. That is exactly the mistake that has kept you frightened in this cottage for 2 years. A secret is only safe while no one is looking for it, and I promise you Crispin is beginning to look. The proof does not protect Tobin by staying hidden. It protects him by being made real, in law, witnessed, filed, and beyond any man's power to burn. We do not hide it deeper. We bring it into the light, quickly, before Crispin can move. We make the boy's claim a fact, and a fact cannot be murdered. And you would do this, Marin said slowly, still scarcely believing him. You would set your own brother's child above yourself. You would take a stranger's word, and a widow you have known for a single day. I would take my brother's word, Corin said, touching the letter. And you are not a stranger. You are the wife he chose and the mother of my heir, which makes you, madam, whether either of us willed it or not, my family. I do not abandon my family. I have too little of it left. He rose to go, for the light was failing, and a duke absent from his own house too long invited exactly the questions they could least afford. I will come each day, he said at the door. I will bring what you need, and you will let me, and we will not argue about it, because it is owed and not given. And you will keep that oilcloth on your person, and trust no one, not the village, not a soul, until my solicitor has the whole matter sewn shut. Marin followed him out into the blue dusk. Bracken lifted his old gray head at the paddock rail and whickered softly. Why does it frighten me more now, she said, to have a powerful man on my side than it did to have one against me. Because, said Corin, swinging up into the saddle, now you have something to lose that can actually be kept. He looked down at her. We will keep it. Good night, Mrs. Fell. It was the first time in 2 years anyone had called her by her true name. She stood in the doorway, long after the sound of his horse had faded into the dark, and did not go in until the cold drove her. He came every day, as he had promised. At first, Marin watched for the catch in it, the hidden price that must surely come due in the end, because nothing in her hard experience of the world had ever taught her that a great man's kindness came without a reckoning attached. She waited for the demand, the condition, the moment the warmth would turn to ownership, but the days went by, and no price ever appeared. There was only the Duke, arriving each gray morning across the moor, shedding a little more of his cold stiffness each time he ducked his head beneath the low cottage lintel, until at last the visit stopped being an event to be braced against and became, without anyone quite deciding it, the settled shape of their days. He brought firewood and good white flour, and proper wax candles instead of the guttering tallow, and once a physician up from the town to look the boy over and pronounce him, to Marin's fierce private relief, sound and strong. But he was careful always to frame these things as the ordinary business of the estate rather than as charity, so that Marin might accept them without swallowing her pride to do it. A tenant's child was the estate's concern, he would say, not looking at her, and leave the sack of flour by the door as though it had wandered there of its own accord. She saw through it entirely, and let him think she did not, because she understood the pretense was itself a kind of courtesy, and courtesy was a thing she had gone without for a long time. He brought, too, a small wooden horse he had carved himself badly over 3 long evenings alone in the study, and pretended it was a trifle when Tobin seized it in both hands and would not be parted from it even in sleep. And he brought, most surprising of all, a deep and unhurried patience with the boy that Marin had never suspected so solemn and burdened a man could possess. He learned without being asked exactly how Tobin liked his bread cut. It was the horse that undid them all in the end, of course. One clear, cold morning, with the frost still white in the shadow of the wall, Corin lifted Tobin up onto Bracken's broad back, steadied him with one firm hand, and led the old stallion at a slow, careful walk around the little paddock, while the boy shrieked with a joy so pure that Hesper had to turn sharply away. "Aye, Prawn." And Bracken, who had been stiff and mournful for so long, arched his scarred neck, and picked up his feet and stepped high and proud through the frost, for all the world as though he too had waited a long time for precisely this, as though the carrying of Gideon's small son were the last and finest commission of his old soldier's life, and he meant to discharge it with full honor. Marin stood at the paddock rail with her shawl clutched about her and watched her son, and her husband's brother, and her husband's horse, all wreathed together in one cloud of frosted breath in the morning light, and felt something rise in her chest she had been far too frightened to let herself feel for a long time. She had built her whole survival, brick by hard brick, on the principle of needing no one at all. Standing at that rail, she was no longer certain the wall would hold. Hesper thawed more slowly, as was her nature, but thaw she did. Within the fortnight, she had gone from watching the Duke with open suspicion to grudgingly setting a 4th place at the little table, and from there to scolding him roundly for tracking moor mud across her clean floor, exactly as though he were a large and careless nephew of her own, and not the greatest landowner in 3 counties. Corin bore it with a gravity that did not quite hide his pleasure. He had not, Marin realized, been scolded by anyone in a very long while. A man surrounded by servants and deference and the bowing weight of his own rank could go a long time without a single soul treating him as merely blessedly human. It was doing him good. She could see it doing him good. It was doing him good. But the true shift, the one that changed how Corin Fell looked at her, came from a different quarter altogether. He had fallen into the habit of talking to her about the estate, at first only to fill the companionable silence over the fire, and then increasingly, because he discovered to his surprise that she listened as no one at Vailmore listened to him. She had lived poor and watchful on the very edge of his land these 2 hard years. She knew the tenant families of the western farms by their Christian names. She knew which households were secretly behind on rents they swore blind they had paid, which cottage roofs let the rain through, which fields had gone sour and which had been quietly overworked to ruin. She knew the whole country from the bottom looking up, where a duke on a fine horse never saw it, and she possessed, beneath the roughened hands and the plain dress, exactly the sort of clear, cool, unsentimental mind that could hold a great many separate facts in view at once and spot the single crack running between them. "Your western rents," she said to him one gray afternoon, over the estate accounts he had lately taken to spreading on the scrubbed table between them. "You have just told me the Hartley farm and the 2 holdings beyond it have paid you nothing at all these 18 months. Not 1 penny, Corin said. I had assumed them simply failing, poor devils. I had half a mind to forgive the whole of the arrears and have done. Then someone has been robbing you to your very face, your grace, and laughing while he does it." She said it flatly, without heat, as one states a plain sum. For old Michael Hartley paid his Michaelmas rent in full not 2 months since. I stood at my own gate and watched him carry the money down the lane and hand it over to the man who came to collect it. A soft-handed gentleman's man in a fine coat, who rides out from the town each quarter day and gathers up the western rents on the Duke's own behalf, and hands back a proper receipt with a proper red seal for every shilling. The farmers out here bless your name for it. They think you have grown wondrously patient and merciful in your grief. They have not the least idea that not 1 coin of what they pay has ever reached your hand. Corin went very still. "Describe this man to me, every particular you can recall." She did, and with every detail she supplied. The cold, hard certainty settled deeper into him, because the man she described was no stranger. But he was Crispin's own valet, the sleek, ever-smiling fellow who stood always at his cousin's shoulder, like a shadow that had learned to bow. Crispin was not merely circling the inheritance and waiting for nature to hand it to him. He was already inside the walls, and had been for months, quietly bleeding the western farms white, forging the Duke's authority on sealed receipts, building himself a private fortune out of Vailmore's stolen rents. And the western farms, Corin understood in one sickening rush, were the far western edge of the moor. They were the very country, the very lanes and gates and empty-seeming cottages, in which one particular hidden house happened to sit. "He has been out here," Corin said slowly, and the words fell like stones. "All this time, his man has ridden these lanes every quarter day for a year and more." "How long, madam? How many more collections, before that sharp-eyed fellow in the fine coat happens to notice a widow and a 2-year-old boy with the unmistakable Fell look about him, living quiet in a cottage that every rent book in the county swears has stood empty since before the war?" Marin's hand rose slowly to her throat. Corin was already on his feet, gathering the scattered papers with swift, decisive hands, his whole mind shifting and ordering itself like a general laying out a field. The gentle uncle of the frosted paddock was gone. In his place stood the other Corin, the one 2 hard years had forged, the man who had learned past forgetting that the world was not gentle, and that anyone who meant to protect what was his had better strike first than wait to be struck. "It changes nothing of our plan," he said, "save only its speed. I ride for the town at first light tomorrow, straight to my solicitor with the marriage line and Gideon's own letter in my hand, and I set the whole weight of the law down between Crispin and this child before my cousin so much as suspects the boy is drawing breath." He paused at the low door and looked back at her, and his voice gentled. "Bar this door tonight, Marin, both bolts, and hear me well. If any man in a good coat comes riding up this moor asking his careful questions before I am back, you are not to be brave, and you are not to stand your ground. You take Tobin, and you take Hesper, and you take that oilcloth bundle, and you go to ground somewhere, only you know, and you wait for me to come. Do you understand me?" She nodded, white to the lips. But some warnings are spoken a single day too late. For even as the Duke of Fielmore rode home beneath a hard, bright climbing moon, resolved to save his brother's son by outrunning his cousin to the law, another rider was already carrying a folded letter south along the town road. It was penned in the small, careful hand of a soft-spoken valet, and for all its neatness it carried but a single piece of news, and that news was ruin. There was a child, it said, out on the western moor, a boy of 2 years, no more. And he had the Fell family's eyes. Corin reached the town before noon and went straight to the dim, paper-smelling chambers of Mr. Rata. Pettigrew, the family solicitor, a small dry man of 60, who had served 3 Dukes of Valemore and buried 2 of them, and who was not easily surprised by anything a great family could produce. He was surprised now. He read the marriage line twice, held it to the window, examined the seal, and set it down with the care of a man handling something that might explode. "It is genuine," he said at last. "I would stake my practice on it. A true entry, properly witnessed, in the register of a real parish. If the child is that marriage's issue, born after the wedding, then he is legitimate beyond any honest question, and he is your heir, your grace, before your cousin, before any man living." He removed his spectacles and polished them, which was how Corin knew the bad news was coming. That is the law. The difficulty is never the law. The difficulty is proof, and proof is a fragile thing. This single sheet and the entry in that far parish register at Marbury are the whole of what stands between your nephew and ruin. Documents can be lost. Registers can burn. Witnesses can be persuaded to misremember, or paid to leave the country, or simply die. Until this is copied under seal, sworn before a magistrate, and lodged where no man can reach it, that little boy's entire future sits on a knife's edge. "Then we lodge it today," Corin said. "This hour we begin today. But hear the rest, for you will not like it." Pettigrew leaned back. "Your cousin has not been idle these 2 years. He has been borrowing, heavily and everywhere, against his expectation of your dukedom. Half the moneylenders in the county hold his paper, and a man who has borrowed against an inheritance has told a great many people that the inheritance is his. He has been letting it be understood, in the clubs and the drawing-rooms, that he is the certain heir of Valemore, and that should any claimant ever crawl out of the woodwork, some scheming woman with a nameless child and a story, it will be a transparent fraud upon a grieving family. He has poisoned the well before anyone came to drink. When the truth of your nephew emerges, it will not meet an open mind. It will meet a county already told to expect a liar." Corin sat with that a long moment. "So even the truth," he said slowly, "will look like the very fraud he has warned them of. Precisely, which is why it must be made unshakable before he can shout it down speed. Your Grace, everything now is speed." They worked through the afternoon. Pettigrew dispatched his own clerk that very evening, riding hard for the distant parish of Marbury, with orders to obtain a certified copy of the register entry, to take the old vicar's sworn statement, and to guard both with his life. Corin left the marriage line and Gideon's letter in the solicitor's strongbox, took certified copies for himself, and rode home under a lowering sky, with the grim satisfaction of a man who has set a good plan in motion, and no notion at all that he was already a day behind. He told Marin everything that night, by the cottage fire, keeping nothing back, because he had decided she was his partner in this, and not his charge. When he came to the part about Crispin's poisoning of her name, that she would be painted before all the world as an adventuress, and her son as a fraud, he watched her face, braced for tears, or fear, or shame. She only looked into the fire. "Let them say it," Marin said at last, quietly. "I spent 2 years terrified of what people like that would think of me. I hid my son in a cottage, because I was afraid of their whispering. And do you know what their good opinion ever bought me, your grace? Not a sack of flour, not one warm night. Their good opinion is a coin that spends nowhere I have ever had to live. I am done being frightened of it." She looked up at him, and her eyes were dry and steady and fierce. "Let the whole of London call me an adventuress, if it keeps Tobin safe. I have been called worse by better." And Corin Fell, looking at her across the fire, understood that he had stopped, some days ago and without noticing the moment, thinking of this woman as his brother's widow, and begun thinking of her as something he did not yet dare to name. The riders came the next morning. While Corin was still at Valemore, arranging the guard, he meant to set discreetly about the cottage. They came, as such men always do, at the hour they judged a household weakest, with the master away, and only women and a child at home. There were 3 of them. 2 were rough, thick-shouldered, hired men on hard-used horses. The 3rd rode a good gelding, and wore a fine coat, and he sat his saddle with the smooth, bland, watchful stillness of a serpent in the sun. Marin knew him before he spoke. She had watched him take old Hartley's stolen rent at her own gate. Sowerby, her husband's cousin's man, the soft-handed smiler. She had been warned, and she had not wasted the warning. At the first sight of riders on the ridge, she had sent Hesper and Tobin out the back and away across the heather to the old peat-cutter's hollow they had chosen for exactly this, with the oilcloth bundle sewn inside Hesper's petticoat. By the time Sowerby drew rein at her gate, the cottage held nothing but Marin, a barred door, and Gideon's old fowling-piece resting quietly across her arm. "Mrs. Ashford," Sowerby called out pleasantly, using the false name, letting her know he knew it was false. "Or ought I to say something grander? Come now, there is no need for that great ugly gun. I am here on the friendliest of errands on behalf of my master, Mr. Crispin Fell. He is a most generous gentleman, and he wishes only to see you and the child comfortably provided for. A sum of money, a passage to somewhere, warm and far away, a quiet, easy life, in exchange for a small signature on a small paper, saying only that there was never any marriage, and the boy has no claim. Surely a sensible woman prefers a purse to a fight." "A sensible woman," Marin said, "knows what a signature like that would be worth to my son once the ink was dry, and what my life would be worth the day after. You may tell Mr. Pramps. Crispin Fell that the widow Fell is not for sale, at his price, or any other." Sowerby's smile did not waver, but something cold moved behind it. He gave the smallest nod, and the 2 hired men swung down from their saddles and started for the door. What followed, Marin would tell it afterward, took less time than the telling. She did not aim the fowling piece at the men. She aimed it at the sky and fired one barrel, and the flat crack of it rolled out across the moor and set the rooks screaming from the oaks, and the hired men flinched and checked. Into that flinch came the second sound, the one Marin had been praying for, the drumming of a hard-ridden horse coming down the ridge at a dead gallop, for the shot had carried, as she had meant it to, all the way to the lane where Corinne Fell was riding out with two of his grooms. He came into the yard like the wrath of God on horseback, and was down and among them before the hired men had finished turning. He was a big man, and a soldier's brother, and 2 years of grief had left a great deal in him that wanted somewhere to go. The first man he took by the collar and threw bodily into the stone wall. The second thought better of the whole enterprise, and bolted for his horse. Corinne let him go. It was Sowerby he wanted, and Sowerby he took, dragging the smooth, soft man half out of his saddle by the front of his fine coat, until their faces were an inch apart. "You came to my land," Corinne said very quietly, which was more terrible than any shout, "to frighten a woman and steal a child, my brother's child. Look at me, Sowerby. Look at my face and carry it back to your master, exactly. That boy is Gideon Fell's lawful son and my sworn heir, and he stands under the protection of the Duke of Valemore. Any man who lays a hand toward him will answer to me personally, and I promise you I will not trouble the magistrates about it first. Now get off my moor." He let go. Sowerby, white beneath his bland mask, gathered his reins. But a cornered schemer's man is never quite finished, and at the gate he turned, and the smile came back, thinner now, and edged. "A pretty speech, your grace, but you protect a claim built on paper, and paper is such a perishable thing. My master sends his regrets, but he thinks you will find, when you go looking to prove this grand marriage of your dead brother's, that the proof has a way of not being where you left it. Good day to you both." And he was gone over the ridge before the meaning of it landed, before Corinne's blood ran cold, before he understood that Crispin had not sent Sowerby merely to threaten. He had sent him to delay and to gloat, because Crispin already had men riding hard for the distant parish of Marbury, and Crispin did not yet know that Pettigrew's clerk had left a full day ahead of them. It was a race now, over roads neither of them could see, and everything, the boy, the name, the future, hung on which rider reached the register first. Corinne would not leave them unguarded that night. He set his grooms to watch the ridge in turns, brought Hesper and Tobin back from the cold hollow, and stayed himself sitting up by the fire long after the boy had been coaxed to sleep in the loft, with the wooden horse clutched to his chest, and the real one dozing safe in the paddock beyond the wall. He told himself it was only prudence. He knew, even as he told himself, that it was not the whole truth. It was Marin who noticed the blood. He had said nothing of it. Of course, a man raised to command does not complain of a scratch. But when he reached to set another log on the fire, she saw the dark stain spread across the sleeve of his shirt, and the stiff, careful way he held the arm against his side, and she was up and across the room before he could wave her off. "It is nothing," Corin said, a graze. "The wall took more of my knuckles than the man did." "Sit down," Marin told him, in exactly the flat, brooking no argument tone he had once used on her in that same room, and she saw him register the echo of it, and saw the ghost of a tired smile pull at the corner of his mouth. "Sit down and let me see it. You are no earthly use to that boy if you bleed quietly into your own coat out of stubbornness. Sit." He sat. She fetched water and clean linen and the small store of salve she kept by her, for a woman raising a child alone on a moor learns quickly to be her own physician, and she rolled back the ruined sleeve and set to cleaning the long, ugly graze along his forearm where the rough stone had opened it. She worked the way she did everything, competently and without fuss. She did not coo over him, nor tell him he had been brave, nor make any of the soft, useless sounds women were supposed to make over a wounded man, because she had learned long ago that pity was a slow poison to a proud man, and Corin Fell was nothing if not proud. And it was there, in that small circle of firelight, with her cool, careful hands upon the wound and the long, exhausting day at last draining out of him, that the thing he had held rigid and locked for 2 full years finally cracked clean across. "I nearly lost him today," Corin said. His voice was low and strange, as though it belonged to another man. "Gideon's boy, the last of my brother left anywhere in the world. I stood in that stable yard and understood, all in a rush, that if I had been an hour slower, or your shot had not carried, or you had lost your nerve for a moment, which you did not, I should have lost the last of my brother a second time, and by my own slowness. And I have been sitting here ever since, thinking that I do not deserve a second chance at that child, because God knows I did not deserve the first." Marin's hands went still upon his arm. "What do you mean by that? We quarreled." The words came out raw, torn loose from somewhere long sealed. "Before he went south, when Gideon bought his commission, against my wishes, I told him he was a fool. I stood in the great hall of this house and told my only brother he was throwing his life away to play at soldiers, that our family had bled enough for kings and parliament, and that I would not give him 1 shilling to go and get himself killed for a ribbon. He told me I had a ledger where my heart ought to be. We said the cruelest things we could reach for, both of us, the way only brothers who know exactly where the soft places are can do. And then he rode away, still angry with me, and I let him go without a word of parting, because I was so certain, the way the living always are, that there would be time later to mend it. There is always meant to be time later. His jaw worked. There was no later. He died in the mud at Waterloo, with my last words to him still hanging unanswered between us. And I never got the chance to tell him I had been wrong, or that I was prouder of him than of any other soul alive, or that I loved him a great deal better than my own life. I have carried that every day since, and I never once learned how to set it down." He stopped, appalled at how much had come pouring out. He had never spoken 1 word of it aloud to a living soul. Marin did not offer him comfort. She did something braver. She rose without a word, went to the loose stone by the hearth where the copies now lived, drew out Gideon's letter, and placed it gently into his good hand. "You have been carrying the wrong thing entirely," she said softly. "You have carried the quarrel like a stone around your neck, when the answer to it was folded in your own breast pocket all along. Read it again. But not as his grieving brother this time. Read it as the man he sat down and chose to write it to." And Corin read once more, by the wavering firelight, the words he had read a fortnight since but had been far too raw to truly hear. He knew Corin would do the decent thing, because Corin had always done the decent thing, even when it cost him, even when Gideon had not. "And be happy, brother, for God's sake." "He was not angry with you," Marin said, watching his face. "Think, Corin, a man who dies, still angry with his brother, does not, before he goes, name that same brother the sole guardian of every last thing he loves in the world, his wife, his son, his good name, his horse. He put all of it into your hands, because he trusted you completely and always had. He forgave you before he ever set foot on that field. He forgave you so wholly, so easily, that it never once occurred to him. It might even want the saying. The quarrel you have been dying beneath, he had forgotten before his horse cleared the gate. You have been grieving a wound that healed itself the very day it was struck. You were only, my dear, the last man alive to know it." Something broke in Corin Fell then, quietly, and it was not the breaking of a man coming apart at last. It was the breaking of a long, hard, killing frost, the first crack of a thaw in ground that had lain iron-locked for 2 winters. He bowed his dark head low over his brother's letter, and his shoulders shook once, and Marin knelt down close beside his chair, and did not look away, and did not rush to fill the silence, and when at last he lifted his face, clearer and younger than they had been since a folded sheet of paper out of Belgium had first turned him to stone. "I do not know the exact day it happened," he said very low. "But at some point, these past weeks, I stopped writing out here every morning for the boys' sake, and started writing out for yours." Marin's breath caught in her throat. His good hand rose slowly, and his fingers brushed a loose strand of dark hair back from her cheek, and then stayed resting there against the line of her jaw, warm and rough and calloused and unbearably gentle, the same hand that had thrown a grown man into a stone wall not 12 hours before. She did not pull away. She turned her face by the smallest degree into the warmth of his palm and closed her eyes. For a long moment there was nothing in the world but the crackle of the fire, and the two of them, and the quiet, and the enormous unspoken thing that had at last come into the open between them. Then, from the paddock beyond the wall, the old gray stallion whickered softly into the dark, low and content, as though something long and faithfully awaited had finally come right. And at the sound of it, Corin drew his hand slowly back, because the boy still slept in the loft above them, and Sowerby's kind still rode the black night roads, and some things, however suddenly true, must nonetheless wait for their proper hour. "When this is finished," he said, and his voice was not steady at all, "when he is truly safe, and the law is sewn shut, and I have nothing left hanging over this house. There is a great deal I mean to say to you then, Marin Fell." "Then you had best," she said, quite as unsteady as he, rising to gather up the bloodied linen so he would not see her face. "Make quite certain that we win." Crispin Fell came to Valemore Hall 3 days later, and he did not come as any kind of suppliant. He came in a hired chaise with 2 attorneys in tow, and all the oiled confidence of a man who believes he holds the only winning hand at the table. And he walked into the great study, where Corin sat waiting, without troubling himself to be announced, and he arranged his coat, and he smiled his easy, poisonous smile. Corin understood at a single glance that his cousin had already, in the privacy of his own mind, quite thoroughly won, and had come only to collect. Marin stood at Corin's shoulder by the desk. Corin had asked whether she would rather not be present for it, and she had looked at him as though he had suggested she sit out her own execution and taken up her position beside him, and that had been the end of the discussion. "Cousin?" Crispin settled himself uninvited into the chair by the fire. His glance flicked to Marin, and dismissed her in the same motion. "And this will be the famous moorland widow. What a great deal of trouble you have both gone to, over one country nobody, and her child. I confess myself almost impressed. But it ends today, and I would very much rather it ended quietly between family, than in a public courtroom that will drag the honored old name of Fell through every gutter in England. So, let me be plain, and let me be generous, for whatever else may be said of me, I am nothing if not generous." "You always were," Corin said. Crispin took it, as he took everything that suited him, as agreement. The situation, laid out simply for the lady's benefit. You will parade this woman and her infant before a court, and claim some secret, convenient marriage. And I will demonstrate that no such marriage can be proven, because the register of that obscure little parish where you claim it took place has most unfortunately and most recently been destroyed. A fire, I understand. Such very old buildings, such dry, brittle old books. And without that, register, cousin, what do you hold? A grieving widow's unsupported word, and a scrap of paper any competent forger in London might produce for £5, set against the settled expectation of the whole county that I am, and have always been, your rightful heir. I shall paint her before the court as exactly what all the world already believes her to be, and the boy a base-born impostor dressed in stolen legitimacy. And I shall win, cousin, because, unlike you, I have spent 2 patient years making certain the ground was well prepared before ever I had to stand upon it. He spread his soft, ringed hands. Or you may be sensible. You acknowledge me, your heir. You discharge my few obligations, some £40,000, a trifle to a dukedom such as this, and you pension the woman off somewhere quiet and distant. The name stays spotless, the child stays fed, and you and I need never be unpleasant to one another again. Come now, Corin, you were always the reasonable brother. Corin, let the silence in the great room stretch out long and thin and cold. Then he rose, walked to his desk, and rested one hand flat upon a thick ribbon-bound sheaf of documents that had been sitting there in plain view the whole while. You are right about one thing, he said. It does end today. You destroyed the register at Marbury. I know that you did in exact detail, because my solicitor's own clerk stood watching your 2 hired men do it from behind the churchyard wall, 3 hours after that same clerk had already ridden away with a full certified copy of the entry, taken under the vicar's own hand and seal, and the vicar's sworn deposition, safe in his saddlebag. And the good old Reverend of Marbury himself is, as of Tuesday last, lodged very safe, very comfortable, and very much alive, as a guest beneath this very roof, where he shall remain until he has repeated his testimony before a magistrate. You burned an empty book, Crispin. You are 3 hours, and one clever old country solicitor, too late. The smile did not fall. It froze, which was an uglier thing to watch. That alone, Corin went on, in the same even voice, would be enough to make my nephew's claim unbreakable in any court in the land. But I find I am no longer content merely to defeat you. I have discovered a desire to understand you first. So I set myself a simple question. Why should a man of comfortable expectations run so thoroughly mad, forge his cousin's authority, terrorize a widow in her home, and put a church register to the torch over an inheritance that might not fall to him for 30 years? It made no sense until I looked into your accounts. He lifted the heavy sheaf and let it fall open upon the desk. You are not comfortable at all. You are ruined. You have gambled and borrowed yourself into a pit £40,000 deep, and your creditors are days from taking the coat off your back. You could not wait 30 years. You could not wait 1. And so, for 18 months, you have been stealing from this estate simply to stay afloat, sending your man Sowerby to collect the Western rents in my name, forging my seal upon the receipts, and pocketing every shilling, while my honest farmers stood in their doorways and blessed my name for a mercy I never knew I had shown them. It was never about the family honor you are so fond of invoking. It was never about the name. It was about money, cousin. It was always only and entirely about money, and you dressed your theft up in the fine clothes of duty, because a thief cannot bear to look upon his own face in the glass. He set down, beside the accounts, a second and thinner bundle, and now it was Marin who stepped forward. And I kept this, she said, and laid a single folded paper atop the pile. and at last looked Crispin Fell full in the face. "A receipt your man Sowerby handed to old Michael Hartley at my own gate, with your forged seal pressed into the wax, on a day he never dreamed a hidden widow was watching from behind a curtain, and remembering every particular. I did not know then what it was worth. I know now. I have many friends among the western farms. Mr. Fell, working people remember the faces of the men who robbed them. Every one of them will swear to your Sowerby before the magistrate." Corin took the paper from her and added it to the rest without taking his eyes from his cousin's ashen face. "Sworn statements from your tenants, which is to say mine, each describing your man to the life. Forged receipts beyond counting, each bearing my stolen seal. And Sowerby's own hand upon the letter he wrote you, announcing that there was a child upon the western moor, which my grooms took from the lining of his fine coat when they searched him. Forgery of a peer's seal, embezzlement. Fraud upon a scale the courts do not forgive. Each of these, standing alone, is enough to hang a man, or to send him in irons to the far side of the world, for the rest of his life." Crispin had gone, the flat dead gray of cold ash, upon a dead hearth. "You would not," he whispered, and all the oil had drained from his voice. "The scandal of it, your own blood, cousin of Fell, in the public dock." "I would grieve the scandal for a single day," Corin said quietly, "and be free of you for the rest of my life. It is the cheapest bargain I have ever been offered, but I am, as you were at such pains to remind me, the reasonable brother. So here is my generosity, and mark me well, for it is the only offer you will ever have from my hand. You will sit at that table within the hour before Mr. Boy. Pettigrew and 2 witnesses, and you will sign a full and perpetual renunciation of any claim to Vale Moor for yourself and every heir of your body forever. You will quit England on the first ship that will carry you, and you will not set foot upon her shores again, while I, or my heir, still draw breath. In exchange, I will lock every page of this evidence in Pettigrew's strong-box, and not use it, for precisely so long as you remain gone and silent. But understand me on this one final point, cousin." Corin leaned slowly forward across the desk, and his voice dropped to that low, terrible register that had made Sowerby flinch and pale in the cottage yard. "If you ever from anywhere upon this earth speak aloud the name of Merrin Fell, or the name of that boy in anger or in scandal or in idle spite over your wine, I will have every page of this sent express to the Crown that same day, and I will spend whatever it costs upon the sharpest lawyers in the kingdom, and I will see you hanged for it. Now, there is pen and ink upon that table. You may sit and sign, or I may ring this bell and send instead for the magistrate. The choice, cousin, as you were so fond of saying, is entirely your own." For a long moment, Crispin Fell sat frozen in the firelight. The whole smiling edifice of his 2 patient years collapsed to rubble around his polished boots, unmasked in his cousin's own study as a bankrupt, a forger, a thief, and a coward, before the 2 people in all the world he had most despised. Then, at last, with a hand that shook so violently it blotted the fair page twice over, Crispin Fell picked up the pen, and he signed. He was gone from Vale Moor within the hour, and from England within the week, and the county which he had so carefully prepared to disbelieve any claimant who might appear, discovered to its infinite delight that it had instead been handed a scandal of an altogether different and vastly more satisfying flavor to chew upon through the long winter evenings. The boy was safe. It was over, truly over, the register secured, the claim made ironclad in law, the enemy signed and sailed away, and for the first time in her whole hard life, Merrin Fell had nothing left to be afraid of. she should have felt only joy. Instead, in the strange flat quiet that follows a long battle won, she felt the ground shift beneath her in a new and frightening way, because now there was no danger left to give her a place, and she did not know what she was to Curran Fell when she was no longer a woman who needed saving. She said as much to him, standing in the study at Valemore, where the whole thing had ended, because she had never in her life learned the art of leaving a hard thing unsaid. "Tobin is provided for," she said. "He is your heir, and he will grow up in this house, safe and named and loved, and that is everything I have prayed for since the night his father died. So I must ask you plainly, Your Grace, what becomes of me? I will not be a kept thing in the corner of your house, tolerated for the boy's sake. I would sooner go back to the cottage and take in mending. I have my pride. It is nearly all I ever had. I know it is," Corin said. "It is one of the things I love in you." Marin went very still. "I have thought about your question a great deal," he went on, and to her astonishment, the composed Duke of Valemore sounded almost nervous. "And I have an answer, but I must give it to you the way I give everything plainly, because I am no good at the other way. Here is the practical case, and you may judge it as coldly as you judge my accounts. The world will always whisper about a widow who lives under a duke's protection. It will call you my mistress and the boy a scandal, and it will never quite stop, no matter how the law is settled, because the world is small and mean and loves nothing better than a fallen woman to point at. There is exactly one thing that closes every mouth in England at a single stroke. They may sneer at a mistress. They cannot sneer at the Duchess of Valemore. They will have to bow to you in the street. And the boy will grow up not as the scandal on the moor, but as the honored heir with a duchess for a mother, beyond the reach of any whisper. That is the practical case. Marry me, and it all falls into place, tidy, as a balanced ledger." Marin's heart was beating very hard. "That," she said, and her voice was not steady, "is a very reasonable proposal, Your Grace. Cold and sound and entirely to the boy's advantage. Is that the whole of it, then? A reasonable arrangement?" "No," Corin said. "No, it is not, and you know it is not, and I cannot let you pretend otherwise." He crossed to her and took both her worn, capable hands in his. "My brother wrote me one command in that letter, the only thing he ever ordered me to do in his whole reckless life. He told me to be happy. 'Be glad, brother, for God's sake,' he wrote, and for 2 years I read it and did not understand it, because I had forgotten what the word could mean. I understand it now. I understood it the morning I knelt on your cottage floor, and a boy I had never met wept into my shoulder, and I understood it more every day. I rode out across that moor toward a low door and a fire, and you are the gladness, Marin. You and that boy. You are the thing my brother could see coming that I could not. So I am not asking you to marry me to close the county's foolish mouths, though it will. I am asking because you brought me a fowling piece and hard truths and cool hands instead of pity, because you mended my accounts and my brother's memory and, God help me, something in me I thought the war had killed for good. I am asking because I do not want to ride home across that moor one more time and leave you behind me. Stay. Marry me. Be the reason I finally do the one thing my brother ever asked." For a moment the fierce, guarded, unbreakable Marin Fell could not speak at all. Then she did the thing she always did, which was to find her feet on solid ground. "You understand," she said, when she could trust her voice, though her eyes were bright, "that I will go on auditing your western rents. I do not intend to be a decorative duchess. Someone in this family must keep the books honest, and it is plainly not going to be a Fell." Corin Fell threw back his head and laughed, the deep, free laugh of a man long out of the habit of it, and gathered his brother's widow into his arms in the middle of the study, where he had defeated his enemy, and answered her the only way that mattered. They were married in the spring, in the small grey church at the edge of the Valemore estate, with the moor gone soft and green around it, and the last of the frost only a memory in the shadowed hollows. It was not a grand society wedding, and neither of them wished it to be. Maren did not wear white. She wore a gown of deep moor-heather violet that Corin had sent all the way to London for, and she looked, the old vicar of Marbury declared to anyone who would listen for years afterward, less like a bride than like a woman finally standing exactly where she was meant to stand. Hesper wept, without shame, into a handkerchief the size of a tablecloth. The tenant farmers of the western farms, who had learned the whole story and taken the Duchess to their hearts as one of their own risen high, crowded the little churchyard in their Sunday best, and Tobin, in a small coat made just for him, held the ring on a cushion with the desperate concentration of a boy entrusted with the fate of nations, and beamed. Bracken, it must be told, was not in the church, for even a soft-hearted duke draws the line somewhere. But the old grey stallion stood at the churchyard wall throughout, groomed to a shine, and when the new Duchess of Valemore came out into the sunlight on her husband's arm, he lifted his scarred old head and whickered at her, and the whole crowd laughed, and Corin swore ever after that it was the horse who had given the bride away. And he was not entirely joking. The news broke over London a week later, and it was not a scandal, it was an earthquake. The gossip columns did not know which way to face. The moorland widow that Mr. Ganda, Mr. Forber, Crispin Fell had warned them all against. The fortune-hunting adventuress with the nameless child had turned out to be the lawful widow of a war hero, the mother of the true heir, and now the Duchess of one of the oldest dukedoms in England, had fled the country, one step ahead of ruin under a cloud of whispered forgery, too delicious to be quite spoken aloud. Society, which had sharpened its knives for a fallen woman, found itself obliged instead to bow very low, and did so because society always does. Crispin's world, so carefully built on other men's money and one patient lie, collapsed in exactly the reverse of the way he had planned it, and out on the moor the summer came in. Maren Fell, who had once barred a cottage door in terror against the very name she now carried as her own, a hidden child at her back and no future she dared to imagine, sat now at the great oak desk in the study at the heart of Valemore Hall, the mistress of everything the eye could reach from its high windows, auditing the quarterly accounts with a red pen and a merciless eye, exactly as she had promised. The house that had stood silent so long was full of noise, a boy's running feet, a duke's rare laughter, an old woman's scolding, the thud of a great grey tail against the study floor. The cold had gone out of the stone. Corin came in from riding the boundaries, mud on his boots, his brother's son up on his shoulders shrieking with laughter, and stopped in the doorway to look at his wife, bent over the ledgers in the afternoon light, and thought, as he did most days now, of a grey morning 2 years and a lifetime ago. He had ridden out that morning, expecting to find a broken fence and nothing more. He had told himself the war had taken everything worth loving, that grief was simply a habit a man learned to carry from one empty day to the next. He had been wrong about all of it. An old horse, stiff and mournful and half-forgotten, grieving in its own animal way for a master who would never come home, had refused to accept the empty paddock in the silent house. Again and again it had broken free and crossed the whole wide moor toward the one place that still held the man it loved, and in doing so it had dragged a frozen, grieving Duke, step by unwilling step, out of his mourning and into the light, to a low door and a fierce woman and a boy with his dead brother's eyes. The horse had not been running away at all. It had been running home, and it had brought the whole broken family home with it. Some griefs, Corin had learned, do not end because we finish carrying them. They end because something we had given up for lost turns out to have been waiting for us all along, out at the far edge of the moor, behind a door we were too heartbroken to open. His brother had asked him, in the last words he ever wrote, to be glad. Watching his wife look up from the ledgers and smile at the sight of her son on his shoulders, Corin Fell was glad at long and grateful lass. And down in the paddock in the warm evening sun, an old gray stallion who had done his final and finest duty cropped the sweet spring grass in peace and did not run away again for the rest of his long and honored days. There was no longer any need. Everyone he loved was at last in the same place. If this story of an old soldier's horse, a hidden family, and a grief finally set down warmed your heart, please tap that like button to help the channel grow. Share it with anyone who loves a fierce, tender heroine, a scarred and honorable hero, and a loyal old horse who knew the way home before anyone else did. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next full-length historical romance. And tell me in the comments below, what was your favorite moment? Was it the chair by the fire, the letter from Gideon, or the old gray stallion at the churchyard wall? I would love to know.